Last night, we all got the news that Rob and Michelle Reiner had been murdered in their homes. I did not know Rob and Michelle very well, but I've been lucky enough to spend time with them, and they were delightful people to be in a room with. I had Rob here on the show for the first time a couple months ago, and I could have talked to him for hours about his work, about his career. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to get invited to a 100th birthday party for Norman Lear. Norman Lear was an incredible creator of television. He was the mind and the heart behind some of the greatest shows ever made. One of them was All in the Family. Rob had been in that show. Rob was also at that 100th birthday party. And Norman was 100 years old, and he was still very with it. I was sitting next to him, and he could hold a conversation. He was incredible to behold. And at the end of the night, there were about 40 or 50 people there. The host of the party said, does anybody here have anything to ask Norman? And somebody said, Norman, how did your career start? How did you know you wanted to do what you did? And, you know, he was a sharp 100-year-old man, but he was still a 100-year-old man. He was sort of struggling to come up with a way to answer that question. And we were all patiently waiting. And then Rob just yelled out from the back of the room. He said, Norman, tell them the story about how you once hid in a birthday present. And then Norman launched into this story that he'd clearly told 100 times, if not more. And it was just the most wonderful story. And everyone was delighted in it. And as soon as one story ended, Rob, who'd known Norman for so long, would just yell out another greatest hit story. And Norman would tell another incredible tale. And I know this sounds like a story about Norman, but it's also a really great story about Rob, because Rob was known. Rob had this reputation for getting the best out of people. And if you watch his films, you know that is something he had the skill with. But to see him in person and know that's what it was like in his real life as well, it was just so truly special to see. And he was laughing harder than anyone at these stories. Obviously, he knew. And, you know, he loved being an audience, and he loved making things for an audience. And he was just a person who was so full of love. And so was Michelle. And you could tell how much they loved each other. And the funny thing is, I don't even remember if that was the story he asked Norman to tell. I remember there was a story about somebody hiding in a birthday present. But I can't ask Norman anymore. And now I can't ask Rob. And that makes me really sad. I'm happy that I can watch Princess Bride. I can watch When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. Rob was no fan of the president, and because of that, the president was no fan of Rob's. This is something everyone knew, but the president still wanted to take the opportunity, just about 12 hours after Rob and Michelle had been murdered in their own home. He wanted to take the opportunity to go on social media and post his thoughts about this tragedy. I feared this was something he was going to do, and I was pretty certain that it would cast a shadow on what was already a really dark day, but it was even worse than I could have imagined. The president made it about himself because he's capable about making it about anything else. And he said the Reiners were reportedly murdered because of their feelings about him, even though no one had reported that. It had been reported that it was likely a troubled family member who had committed this atrocious act, which makes it even more of a tragedy if you are a person with even an ounce of humanity. But you do need at least that 1 ounce. The president also took the time to accuse Rob of having Trump derangement syndrome. He wrote this part in all caps as if that was the headline, the cause, what we should take away from this tragedy. But if we're going to speak about derangement, I really don't think there'll be anything more deranged than watching supporters try to defend the words our president chose in the wake of this awful act. And we've seen the playbook, right? Like it'll either be that they haven't read it yet, or it'll be, you know, this deflection that the president has a way of talking that I don't always agree with, or they'll just run out the clock. and wait until the next tragedy that we'll all get distracted by and hope that we forget what happened today. Or maybe, you know, and again, maybe they'll actually say, you know, this is beyond the pale, right? Like this has gone too far, have you no shame. We don't know. That's their choice to make. It's not ours. The truly worst thing when I heard this last night is my first reaction was like, oh my God, what if this happened because of Rob and Michelle's politics? And then I thought, what if it happened because they were Jewish? And what a terrible time we live in where these are thoughts that rationally come into one's head when something like this happens. And what a good time it would be to have a leader with a moral compass. I remember exactly where I was sitting in Okemos, Michigan, when I was like 11 or 12 years old, and it was the first time I watched Rob's film Spinal Tap on HBO with my parents. And I just remember that feeling as a kid. Like, I just remember like just my ears perking up at the idea of like what comedy could be, like what the kind of stories you could tell. And it was this feeling, I was just thinking today, like years before I met the man, I had been lucky enough to connect with Rob through his work, right? Like I feel as though he had almost like reached out of the television to me, and I'm sure so many other people like me, and said like, you should do this. You should try to do this with your life. It's as much fun as it looks. And, you know, both his work that I was lucky enough to experience, and then the few times I got to interact with him as a person, right? Like he was a man who set an example. And there's such a value in that. And we have to do everything we can to not make setting an example a lost art. So I just want to send my condolences to the Reiner family and just say, Michelle and Rob, rest in peace. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be right back.